everybody, and welcome to episode number 7 of the Clarity Project podcast. I am your host, Carl Umali. So, for today's episode, you already know the drill. I am going to take my handy notebook and I am going to read some of the notes again and reflect on them for you guys. So, for the first one, this is from October 11, 2022. So, let's read it. It seems like every place that should be quiet, they put up a music, and it seems like no one ever wants to hear quiet anymore. There's a feeling inside of you that always wants stimulation, of always doing something, but at the same time, there's also a part that just wants quiet time. And this second one rarely gets satisfied. And so it just lingers and feels bad without you knowing what it is. What this passage talks about, and I think this is from my favorite author, David Foster Wallace. I think what this passage tells us is that we now live in a very noisy world. And through this exposure to the noisy world, noise has become the norm. It has become the constant. I don't know if this is you or not, but you probably can't stand silence anymore. Every time that you're in a quiet room or in a quiet place, you want to be able to be stimulated. When you're eating, you want to be able to watch YouTube videos. When you are trying to study, you want loud music. You want to be able to watch a soap opera or a drama by the side. You want to be able to listen music all the time or a podcast all the time, such as this one. Now, there's nothing wrong with that, but there are extremes to this level. And sometimes all that we want is noise. All that we want is stimulation. And that's where it becomes a problem. Because we need two things. We need time for that, but we also need a time for reflection. We need a time where we can just sit quiet and maybe listen to something that's not noisy or maybe just in complete silence. We need that time to be able to have a time for quiet. Again, there's a feeling inside of you that always wants stimulation, of always wanting to do something. But at the same time, there's also a part that just wants quiet time. And this second one rarely gets satisfied. Because it rarely gets satisfied, and because we are unaware that we actually lack in this one thing, it just lingers and feels bad without us knowing what it is. And so, if you have this feeling of inadequacy, if you have this feeling of feeling lost all the time, despite you being busy and doing fulfilling work, maybe the problem is that you're not giving yourself time to rest. You're not giving yourself time to relax. You're not giving yourself time to just be alone with your thoughts. But there's already a popular notion about this. I forgot who was it from. I don't know if this is the complete thought, but it goes along the lines of all of man's problems comes from not being able to sit still in a room alone with himself. So that's what it is. So I also tweeted something in the past that shares a similar thought to this, which is that every day you should make sure that you should reflect before you sleep. If you don't reflect before you sleep, then you are completely clueless, completely unaware whether that day was good or bad, whether that day has lessons or not. We have to look at each day not in terms of, oh, I failed today, oh, I won today. We should just look at the day and see it for what it is, what happened, what went wrong, where we can improve, how we're going to prevent those things from happening, and how we're going to continue the good things that already happened. Yeah, that's pretty much it. So let's read further into the note. So this one is also from October 11th, I believe, or not. Let me check. Oh, no, it's actually from October 13, 2022. So for this one, I don't care what some people think. Extroversion is as weird as introversion. So this is a thought of mine that I had again in October 13, 2022, and it basically deals with the fact on how most people think that introverted people are weird, right? Because that's the norm, right? Usually they get stereotyped into even in pop culture where they're like this little shy weird kid at the corner of a room somewhere at the back of the class or something like that. Because by default, introverted people will seem weird. And it has become weird for the most part because, well, they're socially awkward. Because the stereotype and the norm is that if you're an introverted person, you're going to come off as weird simply because you're introverted. You don't have that kind of an experience. You don't have that energy level as much as an extroverted person. You don't have that kind of energy for that kind of situation. And so if you're an introverted person, you simply do not have that same skin in the game. And because of this, you will lack the necessary social skills for you to be seen as unawkward in social situations. Because the norm in social situations right now is being loud. The norm usually for social situations is presenting yourself as confident. The norm is that you would mingle to other people and talk to them with such bravado, with such confidence and such flair that they like whatever it is that you're telling them. There is this idea of being confident that is so intertwined with communication. When we look at a great communicator, we don't think of someone that is shy or is that introverted or is very recluse or is someone who is a man of few words or something like that. Now, for me, a lot of people have a weird experience from knowing me because my default is not talking, believe it or not. My default is just being quiet, of just observing, of just being in the moment, of being alone with my own thoughts or activities. There are definitely a lot of times where I'm just going to be quiet. A lot of my college classmates actually even would come up to me and ask me if I'm okay because for the whole class, I was just quiet. And they think that something's wrong when in reality, no, that's just my default. I'm not sad, I'm not depressed or anything like that. I'm just quiet because there's nothing to talk about. There's really nothing for me to put my energy on. And that's why I'm in that kind of a level. But the thing for me is that when things matter most, I have no problem between switching from quiet mode into communication mode. Because even if the default is introversion, I also enjoy communication. I also enjoy connecting with other people, of knowing their stories, of understanding their life, of seeing how they think and observing how they process the world. And so when I wrote this down, that I don't care what some people think, extroversion is as weird as introversion. As an introvert who gets to observe, I also think that that shouldn't be the case because introverted people seems weird. But have you ever really reflected on what that actually means? Have you try and stop and think about the reality of how weird extroverted people actually are? If you really have time to be able to think clearly about this notion, you'll be able to realize that no, not all introverts are weird. And at the same time, not all extroverts are not weird. Because if you get to observe an extroverted person, that's when you realize that, oh my gosh, extroverted people are actually much weirder than introverted people. They're always loud all the time. They're trying to convince you of some business, of some idea, of trying to tell you that this is the best thing in the world. They're always in your ears all the time. They always want attention. They're always flamboyant. They're always doing all of these extracurricular things. To some degree, to the very extremes, these can be seen as weird, especially if you are relentless in doing those kinds of things, especially if you seemingly have tons and tons of energy and you just don't stop. You immediately become annoying. You immediately become unbearable. You immediately become vexing. And an even weirder fact about this is that some extroverts, they're not even aware or they lack the self-awareness to see that other people are getting annoyed at them because they're just that full of energy. And sometimes there's nothing wrong with that. It's just the wrong situation. Sometimes there's nothing wrong with that. It's just the wrong place and time for that kind of a thing. And that's why I said in the most extremes, you could be able to see that introverts can be weird. That's true. But let us not put that kind of identity on introverts alone. If you see extroverts and what they are doing, it's also so weird. They could be full of energy. They can't stand in one place. They're always going from room to room, from person to person, of seemingly wanting to talk to everybody in the room like some kind of politician, can become weird. So I guess, that is just a lesson on how we should look at how we should judge people, because the next time that an extrovert judge someone who's really quiet, who's really shy, and tells that that's a weirdo, right? That person is so weird, it's really quiet all the time. You know what that introvert person is thinking about you? You know what that introverted person is probably saying to himself? No, you're weird. You can't shut up. You're always yapping about nonsense. I could be able to accept that if most of the things that you're saying is actually good. But the problem is, most of the things that you're saying is actually bad. They're nonsense. They're useless. It's wasted energy. So, yeah, that's what I think about introversion and extroversion in terms of it being weird. All right, so to wrap this episode up, I'm going to read something from October 12, 2022. I've skipped this. So, this is about generosity, and it goes out like this: Generosity is a slippery slope. Once you become generous, you will have to keep giving and then giving more in order for everyone to continue seeing you as generous. Anyone who intends to have a reputation of being generous must lavishly keep on giving. People you don't help, or worse, just because you did not help them first or more, will dislike you. By doing this, you end up being more generous and continuously maintain it and up it than your usual level of generosity. You become more generous than you actually are. And if you've been following the Clarity Project for a while, I've already touched and talked about this kind of topic in a short of mine, or a real short video of mine. And here it is. Right, boop. But basically, that reel is also talking about generosity. I think this idea came from Naval Ravikant. And what this talks about is how generosity is a slippery slope. Because being generous is actually a pretty hard thing to do. Because number one, you have to maintain it in order for other people to see you and continue to see you as generous. And of course, there's also levels to generosity. We're talking about levels of generosity in terms of how frequent you give and in terms of how much you give. And those two things must be satisfied to the person that you're giving to. And the worst thing is that even if you ended up giving someone your generosity, or ended up giving someone something, if you did not make them the first choice, or you did not give them the generosity first, they will actually believe that you are less as generous as you are, or that you are less generous to them and you are more generous to the other person who came in first. At the same time, if you only help them a little and they get the news that you help this other person more, they will think to themselves that maybe you're not as generous as they think you are. And so this becomes an endless cycle of you just giving out more than what you actually want, of you giving more than what you can actually afford, because you cannot stop. If you stop and they ask something from you again, they will think to themselves, wow, you stopped being generous. You started becoming stingy. You started becoming selfish. You have changed. When in reality, no, you did not change. You just probably don't have the capacity to be able to give that much anymore. And so that's the weird thing about generosity, because it's seemingly unending. It traps you in a kind of identity wherein you actually have to give more and more frequently than what you actually want. You end up being more generous than what you actually are. So, yeah, that's the whole idea. The next question would be, how are we going to prevent this? Should we not be generous in the first place? Or what is it? What is it that I'm going to do with it? Well, I have a few ideas about that. And number one is that, sometimes you feel like you should help, but it comes with communication always, because really the problem here is that there's miscommunication in terms of who you are, in terms of being generous, and versus the things that you are giving out. So I guess that there's really just a miscommunication between the giver and the receiver. Of course, the problem with that is that it doesn't work all the time, or at least it doesn't reflect or doesn't apply to most of the things in terms of giving and being generous, because not all transactions happen face to face. Sometimes you are giving this other person something, but that person is not the receiver. It's just someone who's in the middleman who's going to eventually give it to your end cause. So there's really no way around that. But being honest, being transparent, being truthful, and being communicative in terms of when you are giving out something. You have to lay it out exactly why you are giving it and how you were able to give it. But again, that's also a wrong thing, because it defeats the purpose of being generous. Being generous means no questions asked. Being generous means no further explanations needed. You're just giving. That's it. What's more to think about? I'm just giving you this. Why do the other person need to know why? Why do the other person needs to know where it came from? No. Are you being kind? Are you being generous? Good. Just give it. So yeah, that's really the conflict there, because on one side you want to be able to explain where you're coming from, but at the same time it feels really bad and it feels really wrong to be able to explain that, because that defeats the purpose of being generous or being kind in the first place. Because if you're thinking about something, you're not being kind. That's the kind of the notion that people think about. But I don't think that's really entirely true, because just because you're thinking about something, you're not kind. No, I believe that you also have a brain. I believe that you also have ways on discerning whether you have the capacity to help this person or not. Now, it is up to you whether you're going to disclose that to the other person or not. But again, in most use cases, it's probably not going to work, because if you are just going to give it to someone, just give it to them. Maybe it kind of depends on the levels of relationship that you have with this other person or the receiver. That's why one of the smartest people that I know, Naval, said that it's a slippery slope. It's almost like a catch 22. There's no way around it. So yeah, I guess that wraps up our episode number 7 of the Clarity Project podcast. And if you watch the whole thing in snippets, or if you watch it as a whole, sure enough, there will be more in the future. And so, yeah, thank you and goodbye.